Good evening, everyone. Hello? Okay, good. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at the Kennedy School of Government, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this terrific event. We're here to celebrate a remarkable magazine. It's been dubbed the preeminent political journal in America by Slate.com, the Oracle of American Politics by Wolf Blitzer. Not that these people would want to be endorsed necessarily by either of these groups. The Weekly Standard has just made an indelible imprint on American politics and in our country and increasingly around the world. Its impact on Washington, D.C. and outside has really been stunning, and indeed you'll hear more about it tonight from today's panelists. I'm sure the discussion tonight will be quite mild. I think there'll be no interesting or controversial things stated, but nonetheless, it's nice to have a celebration on a stale topic. And what I'm especially here to do is to welcome all of our panelists, but Bill Kristol in particular, because as many of you know, Bill got his start here at the Kennedy School. He was on the faculty, and all of his good ideas, I think he believes he got from students and faculty here. He may want to correct that slightly. But he made a very impressive imprint for us, and frankly, we're quite humble here at the Kennedy School, so we do want the record to show that we did know him before he was on Jon Stewart. So we do miss having Bill around, and indeed I hope we'll have him teaching a course for us in the spring. So that's something you can all look forward to, I hope. And it's especially my honor to be here to help celebrate this milestone. So without further ado, I should turn it over to someone else who needs relatively little introduction. Jeanne Shaheen, our new director of the Institute of Politics. She too has had some pretty significant role in politics in America, not always from the same side, but she'll be our moderator tonight. So with that, let me turn it over to Jeanne Shaheen. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Elwood. As director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School, it's my honor to welcome you all to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. The Institute of Politics was created in 1966 as a memorial to President Kennedy. Our mission is to inspire young people to careers in politics and government, and also to serve as a bridge between academia and practical politics. Tonight, we hope to do a little bit of both, to inspire and to bridge build. We're honored to gather this evening to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Weekly Standard. To make it in the magazine business, one needs two things, ideas and money. And fortunately, the Weekly Standard has both. As Eric Eichmann wrote in the Wall Street Journal, Bill Kristol, Fred Barnes, and John Podhoretz came up with the idea, and Rupert Murdoch came up with the money. But successful magazines earn not only the esteem of their ideological peers, but also the respect of their opponents. Eric Alterman from the liberal Nation magazine described the Weekly Standard by stating, "Reader for reader, it may be the most influential publication in America. Their circulation may be small, but they're not interested in speaking to the great unwashed. The magazine speaks directly," this is his quote, Fred, not mine. "The magazine speaks directly to and for power. Anybody who wants to know what this administration is thinking and what they plan to do has to read this magazine." And it appears that many in the current Bush administration were doing just that 8 years ago. As Washington Post staff writer Peter Carlson explained in his recent column, quote, "The most important idea advanced in the Standard came in the essay, 'Saddam Must Go,' written by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan in November 1997. In his column, Carlson points out how well the Standard is written when he says, and I quote again, "Some left-wingers probably don't read the Weekly Standard because they figure it's a Rupert Murdoch-owned, right-wing, warmongering magazine, and of course they've got a point." I'm continuing to quote here. But now, as the Washington-based mag prepares to celebrate its 10th anniversary, it's worth noting that the Weekly Standard is truly an excellent right-wing, warmongering magazine, no matter what your political persuasion might be. Well, whether you agree with the political philosophy of the Weekly Standard or not, the magazine follows a great tradition and a critical principle of our democracy. It represents the power of the press as well as the power of ideas and outstanding writing. Tonight, with us to discuss the 10th anniversary of the Weekly Standard, we're honored to host an esteemed panel. To my left is one of the founding editors of the Weekly Standard and its current editor, Bill Kristol. He served as Vice President Dan Quayle's Chief of Staff during the first Bush administration and helped shape the political strategy that won control of the House of Representatives in 1994. Mr. Kristol is a regular contributor to the Fox News Channel, and as you heard from Dean Elwood, he is not only a former faculty member here at the Kennedy School, but a Harvard graduate who received his PhD here in 1979. As Dean Elwood said, we're very proud to have you back here tonight. To his left, we're fortunate to have another of the founding editors and the current executive editor of the Weekly Standard, Fred Barnes. Prior to his tenure at the Standard, Fred served as senior editor of the New Republic from 1985 to 1995. For 10 years, he was a regular panelist on the McLaughlin Group and presently is the host of the Beltway Boys on Fox News Channel. We're happy to welcome another former Harvard alum of the Nieman Fellows, Fred Barnes.
Thank you.
Our next guest, Martha Bayless, teaches humanities at Boston College and is a frequent cultural writer for the Weekly Standard. She contributes regularly to the New York Times, to the Wall Street Journal, and Wilson Quarterly, where she was literary critic. She's best known for her book, Whole Our Soul, The Loss of Meaning in American Popular Culture. Currently, she's writing books on the collapse of U.S. cultural diplomacy, and she too is a graduate of Harvard College. We're delighted to have Martha Bayless with us here this evening. And finally, on the end, as a contributing editor to the Weekly Standard, our last panelist is one of this country's leading political satirists, P.J. O'Rourke. P.J., however, is not a graduate of Harvard.
Couldn't have gotten in with a crowbar.
He served as the editor-in-chief of National Lampoon and worked as foreign affairs desk chief at Rolling Stone. His book, Republican Party Reptile, was a bestseller, and a sampling of his other books include Give War a Chance, Parliament of Whores, The CEO of the Sofa, Holidays in Hell, and Eat the Rich. Nice titles. Please welcome P.J. O'Rourke. We'd like to have a conversation for about 40 minutes or so and then open up for questions and commentary with the audience. But I'd like to begin, Bill, by asking you first about the origins of the Weekly Standard. Talk, if you will, about what motivated you, what you were thinking, and how you got the magazine started.
I guess it was early 1995, and I had been running something called the Project for the Republican Future, which had worked on the Republican congressional takeover in '94, and it was an independent little think tank, sort of political operation. And I realized pretty quickly that Majority Leader Bob Dole and Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich weren't really interested in my constructive criticisms anymore now that they were in the majority. You know, it's one thing to have fun when you're trying to take things over. It's another thing to criticize them when they're in power. And I also thought really there was room for a weekly conservative magazine of politics and culture out of Washington. There really wasn't anything like that. National Review was bi-weekly in New York. And Fred was interested in taking this, joining this adventure from the New Republic, and we were lucky enough to get backing from Rupert Murdoch. We came up with the name The American Standard, which we thought was an excellent name to kind of convey that this would be all about American politics and culture. And then one of us went into a restroom in a hotel one day and noticed that so every American Standard is a very successful company, is my conclusion, but probably not the best name for a magazine. So we switched at the last minute to Weekly Standard and launched exactly 10 years ago, Labor Day 95. It was at the height of the showdown between Gingrich and Clinton, as you well remember. And Fred wrote one of the cover pieces about Newt. The cover was Permanent Offense, with a picture of Newt Gingrich sort of conquering the Capitol. Within about 2 months, the Republicans were on permanent defense, and Clinton had totally outfoxed Gingrich, and that was the beginning of our successful 10 years of predictions and analysis of Washington politics.
We're still giving permanent offense.
Right, that's right.
Yes, and you all should feel free to jump in and add what you like. Fred, how's the political debate in Washington changed over the last 10 years, and what impact has the Standard played in that, do you think?
Well, I think we played a big role. We started a war in Iraq. We got tax cuts. We reelected Bush. We've had great influence. You said earlier, Jeanne, that that we're a magazine that speaks for and to power. I think of us as more as criticizing power, and rather than reflecting what the Bush administration might do, we really try to tell them what to do, and occasionally they go along. Sometimes we've had a mixed message. We certainly did in 2000 when we divided. Fortunately, we don't, as a magazine, we don't endorse candidates for president, and some that were for McCain and some were for Bush, and the magazine had favorable and unfavorable articles on both sides. And we're not really an orthodox Republican magazine in any way. I mean, you think of the policies of the Bush administration that we've criticized, the war in Iraq not being one of them, but certainly the post-war performance of the Bush administration in Iraq, Bush and Rupert Murdoch's policies toward China. We've certainly been critical of those. And in many, many other areas, I think we are certainly more pro-life than the Republican establishment is in Washington or anywhere else. We were among the first conservatives to criticize the performance of Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House. I take some credit for that. So we're not an orthodox conservative or an orthodox. I think I'm probably the only one at the Weekly Standard who's written a cover piece in praise of highways. You don't find that in many other magazines. We are certainly not libertarians by any, the phrase has been used, the phrase big government conservative. It's one I've tried to kill because most people, when they hear the description of somebody as a big government conservative, they think that person is a liberal. But if there is such a thing as a big government conservative, I think we probably represent that person. But I'll tell you, the question I'm most asked about the Weekly Standard is, by people you meet and you say you're from the Weekly Standard, and they say, "Oh, how often does the magazine come out?"
And how do you answer that?
I say weekly and try not to roll my eyes.
Well, let me ask you, as you point out, the magazine has been willing to take on the conservative establishment and some of conservative orthodoxies. What has been the reaction from that base of the magazine when you've done that?
I once, after Bill wrote a sneering piece about Trent Lott, I'm sure you remember the piece, Bill, I happened to run into Trent Lott the next day after the magazine came out in the green room at Fox. And I got a 20-minute lecture on the failures of the Weekly Standard and how it's not helping out on Capitol Hill. I don't regard our job as to help out on Capitol Hill, but the magazine can get some very strong reactions.
Jeanne, you'll be surprised to hear this, but politicians are somewhat thin-skinned.
I can't imagine
and
that.
the term constructive criticism, they think that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing. So I try to explain sometimes to our friends in the Bush White House that, a little helpful criticism, suggestions of how they might do better in some of their areas of foreign policy, that this is an attempt to, improve actually their performance, since they're running the country and we all care about how the country goes. But they tend to be a little bit, they don't really like criticism. But that's why it's fun. There's no point just saluting, right?
Actually, in your introduction to the book, you talk about, you call it the fallacy of secret design, is that?
Right. I mean, people overinterpret, I would say, the Weekly Standard. An awful lot of what goes into a weekly is the best stuff that comes in and the best stuff that you commission, and then of course some of the stuff you commission some of the articles you commission don't come in on time, and a big news event happens on Wednesday, and someone on your staff says, hey, I think I have an interesting angle on it, and then a good piece comes in over the transom Thursday morning, and then you put out the magazine, and then people come up to you the next week and say, what was the strategy between having exactly those pieces in the magazine? And you just try to put out the best magazine you can. That's really the one thing I guess I've learned. I mean, Fred, everyone on this stage had much more experience in journalism than I did when we started the magazine, but you really just need, at the end of the day, to publish the most intelligent, interesting stuff you can, and not overthink, an agenda or who you're going to influence or who's reading it. Our circulation's up, and lots of really diverse people read it, I think, around the country. I run into people, including many people who aren't Republicans and aren't conservatives, and I'm struck how many people say, and I'll say this because partly because Martha and PJ are here, and they've both written quite a lot for the back of the book. I'm struck, from the beginning, we really tried to have a strong cultural section, interesting and diverse articles on books, arts, big think cultural developments, little think cultural developments, famous authors, obscure authors. And I'm really struck how many people I run into who appreciate that part of the magazine and read it. And I think there we've always tried. We're perfectly happy to criticize things and make fun of the idiocy of the cultural establishment and the universities, and Harvard, thank you, provides many opportunities for ridicule. And but I would say, generally speaking, we decided pretty early on. Jody Bottom, our books and arts editor for about 7 years, said this once to me, it's just tiresome at some point, complaining about the culture, complaining about how things are going downhill, and it's more important to sort of praise and call attention to interesting developments and promising developments, or obscure authors who deserve to be rediscovered. Martha's done some terrific stuff for us along those lines, and I think that's actually been a contribution to the magazine that I wouldn't have expected necessarily when we began, because we were so focused on politics and so Washington-based, but I think I'm pleased with that part of the magazine.
I think there are a lot of us who would agree with that, and that's a perfect segue into my question for you, Martha, which is, in your recent Washington Post article on public and cultural diplomacy, titled Now Showing the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly Americans, you said that America is exporting more than enough depictions of profanity, nudity, violence, and criminal activity to violate norms of propriety still honored in much of the world. What do you think can be done to counter that negative impact of some of America's pop culture?
Well, I'm going to announce tonight that I have the solution to the problem. I've been keeping it to myself up until now.
You certainly have.
Yes. I'm going to take this opportunity to solve the public diplomacy problem that has been plaguing Washington for some years now. You'll be glad to know. It's very hard to solve it, and I don't have the solution. There's a couple of things that are unprecedented. One is it's the post-Cold War pattern of cutting way back on cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy in general. Fortunately, with this crowd, I feel I don't have to define those terms. I feel like here people understand what those terms mean. Public diplomacy being American attempts to make friends around the world and persuade people that our policies are wise and prudent and important. And cultural diplomacy being a sort of strange bedfellow with that, which is an attempt to showcase the very best of American culture and art and education and science and so forth.
Jay McInerney, just for instance.
If you say so. Now, I was expecting worse, so I'm glad I got over your first heckle. Proceed. Now, those things were cut way back after the victory we won in the Cold War. We didn't any longer need to persuade the world that we were wonderful, because it was self-evident to the world that we were wonderful, and certainly self-evident to us that we were wonderful. Meanwhile, at the same time, there was an opening of markets in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and in many other places in the world for American entertainment products, American popular culture. Now, if you know my work at all, you know that I'm not a curmudgeon who dumps on popular culture. I'm someone who has championed its great strengths and beauties and vitality over the years. But that doesn't stop me from dumping on it when I think it's really crappy. And we now have opened the floodgates to the rest of the world. Maybe I should use a different metaphor. The levee has broken, and our popular culture is flowing into the rest of the world in an unprecedentedly untrammeled and unchecked way. We no longer have the self-regulation that the entertainment industry used to impose on itself through the Hayes Office, the Network Departments of Standards and Practices, et cetera. Cable TV was never regulated because it never fit the legal definition of what could be regulated, and so forth. Of course, I'm not even talking about the internet, which we can't even define legally for purposes of regulation. So it's all flowing out in an unprecedented way. And at the same time, at the end of a 15, 20-year period, when Americans of all stripes, colors, and political persuasions have been concerned about the state of popular culture and its, some of the extremes in popular culture. And this is happening in all sorts of places that are not just the religious right or the bastions of cultural conservatism. So we have this very peculiar situation. How do we solve it? That was the question you asked me, wasn't it? I can offer one thought about it and see what others have to say. I do think we need a much more robust presence around the world of what else there is in America. And we need a much more robust ability to bring people to America and to send Americans around the world. These are the oldest ideas in public diplomacy. Person-to-person exchange and politically unhindered, politically untainted cultural exchange. They're very old ideas. They go back to the Carnegie Foundation in 1910. I think we need more of that because there are a lot of people around the world who don't know anything about America except what they see on Jerry Springer or whatever bootleg films are in the marketplace, and those are usually not the best films that are bootlegged in the marketplace, et cetera. And I could maybe make some other ideas, but I don't have a good solution. I don't think what we're doing now with the broadcast emphasis is going to do it. It's a very difficult problem.
It is. I actually remember talking to the French consul shortly after I got elected governor, and we were talking about why we couldn't get any people from France to come to New England or New Hampshire, and he said, well, it's because they all want to go to Dallas, because that's the TV show they watch, and so that's what they're excited about. Now, Martin Frost might like that, since he's from Texas, but I think that's the challenge that we face. People see those images, and that's their view of the United States and Americans.
I have a daughter who just moved to Bristol, England, and she found they moved on a block, an English block, all English families, a lot of young kids. They'd all been to the United States. They'd all been to Orlando.
Yeah.
Not
Worse
New
than
York.
Dallas. Worse than Dallas.
PJ, you once wrote that a little government and a little luck are necessary in life, but that only a fool trusts either of them.
Yes.
As you talk to the students who are here tonight, what would you say to them about how much they should trust government? And what would you tell them about how to hold elected officials accountable?
Well, first I'd tell them, isn't this the second day of school? Right? I mean, shouldn't you be looking for someone to date or something? I mean, it's a long, cold Boston winter. But putting that aside for a moment, perhaps you are here looking for someone to date. That would be sad. Because you're only young ones. Actually, I'm all wrong about that. You can absolutely trust government. You can trust government completely to do what is best for government. You can trust the people who govern to do what is best to increase their power to govern, the length of time that they do govern, the amount of things that they have governing influence over. You can absolutely trust government. You can see where government is headed from a million miles away. This doesn't particularly bother me. I mean, I think that if we did not live in a world of self-interested people, it would be creepy. I think we all know that the people who give us the willies worst, I mean, outside of pure sociopaths, the people of reasonably decent people who give each of us the personal willies worst are the altruists. Is it not true? Don't they make the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up a little bit? Because you don't know what they're in it for, you know? At least you can see what people in government are in it for. However, I personally prefer people who are in it for money to people who are in it for power. For one thing, money's neutral. Money can be used for good things, for bad things, for silly things, for smart things. Who knows? I mean, it can be used for, in fact, it is necessary for any form of activity. Whereas power is always to do with the coercion of other people, whether it's good coercion or bad coercion, it's always about the coercion of others. And power is zero sum. Money is not zero sum. When you have money, you have not taken money away from other people. Well, maybe you have. If you were the defense minister of the interim government in Iraq, you have taken money away from others. But generally speaking, when you make money, you do not take money away from other people. When you take power, you do take power away from other people. So I don't like government on that grounds, on the zero-sum grounds. And the other thing that upsets me about government, or not upsets me, it makes me dislike government, is that governing does not come with that built-in Adam Smith invisible hand that private enterprise comes with. One of the things that is marvelous about private enterprise, and so impressed Adam Smith and impressed Milton Friedman and impressed Hayek and many other people who bothered to look at it carefully, is that fantastic thing of how we do good for others when we never ever meant to. All we wanted was a better parking spot for ourselves and a better car to park it in, bigger house, fancier clothes. But in the process of doing this, we created stuff that was of great assistance and aid to our. There is no invisible hand in government. That hand is very, we call it the visible foot, as a matter of fact, because it usually sticks out into the aisle to trip people up. But even when government does good, it hardly does it invisibly. As a matter of fact, they've got all sorts of people assigned to make sure that whatever good government does, it does as visibly as possible, so that the people in the government can get reelected next time around due to all the good things that they did. So, I see no hidden benefits to government. Obviously, there are benefits to government, but I see no hidden benefits for government. And that's why I am not a huge. It's interesting for me to write for the Weekly Standard, because the Weekly Standard is very interested in the machinery of politics. And I am sort of interested in getting it to rust. But no.
No, I'd say, when Fred said that we at the Weekly Standard tend not to be from the libertarian wing of conservatism, which I think Fred and I aren't, I would say there is diversity on the other hand among our contributing editors. And despite your fine governance of New Hampshire for all those years, one of your constituents here still isn't really convinced that government does a lot of good. No, but PJ and Andy Ferguson, a couple of our, who's a terrific writer on our staff, I'd say have spent a lot of time exposing how, in a very funny way, how government programs go awry, which is a core, of course, conservative insight, even for those of us who do believe in a limited and energetic and strong, sometimes, government. So.
Well, PJ is not inconsistent with where a number of my former constituents in New Hampshire were. So,
Right.
And because we're at the Kennedy School of Government, which supports good government and works very hard to encourage that, I expect a number of students who are here to take on PJ as soon as we get to the question and answer session.
And I don't think Dean Elwood will be making the job offer to PJ right after the right after the panel. No, it's actually, I would say, having taught here at the Kennedy School, to be fair, a lot of the economists especially, but also the students of public management at the Kennedy School spend a lot of time explaining the limits of government programs, how they go wrong, and so ironically, the Kennedy, of the different parts of Harvard, I would say the Kennedy School of Government is often hard-headed and even skeptical about government programs in a way that people down the few blocks away in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences sometimes are not.
Good, thank you.
Desperately trying to save my, decent relationship with the Kennedy School here.
And Dean Elwood's written that down
Thank
so
you,
that he
right.
can use it again. Let's talk a little bit about politics, since we've got about 5 minutes before we open it up for questions. A lot of people are expecting that the Weekly Standard will really looking to the Weekly Standard to assess the Bush second term. What's the impact that Katrina will have on the agenda that the president had laid out for this second term? Things like Social Security and tax reform and Iraq and winning the war on terrorism.
Fred had a piece on this in this week's issue. You should.
Well, I don't think they affect the sequence in which these things come up in Congress, for one thing, but it's been vastly overrated how bad the Katrina hit hurt President Bush. He dropped 3 or 4 points, depending on which poll you look at, in his job approval rating, which is not nothing, but on the other hand, hasn't meant that he can get nothing done in Congress. I mean, does anybody think because of Katrina that John Roberts is not going to be confirmed, or that has been affected in any way by Katrina? I don't think so. It means that you have all this, rather than some other issue that comes up, you have this big body of Katrina legislation that will come up in Congress. You will have the second Supreme Court nomination, which you would have had anyway, and you will probably get to immigration. You weren't going to get to Social Security reform anyway. That's already pooped out this year anyway. And you're going to wind up at the end of the term with, not at the end of the year with Republicans, or maybe next year, trying to raise a tax issue again. And so it really hasn't changed that much. It is an interesting thing that I think is true about President Bush. His strength and power in Washington is not based on high poll ratings, because he only had them briefly after 9/11. He was elected with what, Bill, 52% or 53%, something like that. And they're much lower. And I mean, I've compared it to President Clinton, whose ratings, even when we were writing critical articles and urging that he be not only impeached but convicted, that his numbers stayed up in the 60s. Sometimes, I think the week he was impeached, his poll numbers were higher than ever, in the high 60s, something like 68 or 9% job approval rating. And yet he accomplished practically nothing. George W. Bush, with relatively low poll ratings, has accomplished a great deal. So the polls are vastly overrated.
I mean, I would say, I was just talking with a couple of Republican congressmen this week, I think ironically what the president's faltering response at first to Katrina, and then I think he recovered pretty well, but this huge spending package, some of which obviously is necessary and urgent, but the broader kind of semi-war on poverty he announced last week in New Orleans, I'd say that finally you may get Republicans on the Hill getting serious about spending. Now, whether the administration's willing to be serious about curbing spending is really a question. But I'm struck talking to these members. I just think no one's thought that the politics were there to really curb spending over the last 4 years. It was 9/11. There was a closely fought Congress. Republicans were very united behind Bush prior to November 2004 for obvious reasons. A lot of them hated the Medicare prescription drug bill. They thought it was bad policy, but the president said it was important, and they gave him an important legislative victory. I think that may be running out. I mean, it is his second term. He's not a lame duck, but he's not running again. And these guys are running again. And I'm struck just talking to people this week how, at least among the conservatives on the Hill, there's a real sense that their constituents don't want them just throwing money out the door without any offsets. And we could have a pretty interesting year next year for that reason. I think the Democrats will come back trying to either increase taxes on the wealthy or at least block making the tax cuts permanent. I think Republicans will fight hard on tax cuts, but there will be pressure on them to then get serious about spending cuts. Mike Pence of Indiana is proposing putting off the prescription drug benefit for a year, which I'd say 3 months ago, if you had said that was a sort of serious proposal, people would have said that's political suicide. Pence told me that he was in 5 meetings in his district, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and this had been headlined in the Indianapolis paper, and that people were saying, yeah, why not? If your house gets damaged suddenly, if a tree falls on your house, you have to make special expenditures to fix that up. You put off something else you wanted to do. And I think the political dynamics, I sort of agree with Fred that I don't think Katrina has fundamentally changed Bush's approval. I mean, he took a hit, but I think he can recover from that. But it could change the dynamics, I think, on the spending issue, especially over the next year. That'll be interesting to see.
Witness Senator Sununu putting forward the idea of an inspector general for the distribution of these funds to Katrina. I think that our local fiscal conservatives, of which we've got a passel in New Hampshire, are going to have a little more clout in upcoming legislation than they have heretofore.
So are we going to see a split within the Republican Party over priorities?
Well, there are lots of splits in the Republican Party. I mean, a lot of Republicans worry about that, but that's part of what it means to be a majority party. There have never been more splits in parties than in the Democratic Party at the height of its ascendancy. Southern segregationists, Northern civil rights activists, union members, rural Democrats, conservative skinflints, and liberal big spenders. To be a majority party in America, and the Republicans are very narrowly, I would say, the majority party now, or at least certainly at parity or parity plus means to have lots of disparate elements in the party. They've done a pretty good job, I think, the congressional leadership and certainly the Bush administration at holding the parts together. But inevitably, as you get to 2008, I think, when presidential candidates gear up, it begins to priorities different people will advance agendas for
Opposition
different
unites.
priorities.
Opposition
Well, if
unites.
you get
But
opposition-
governing splinters, I think.
you
It's
get
hard to
opposition-
govern. That's, I mean,
The next question is, will the Democrats be able to take advantage of get any purchase on the situation? And I think one needs to look a little beyond the current polls toward an outcome where suddenly Republicans rise up and argue for cutting spending for Americans, but continue to support massive spending for the war in Iraq. If a Democrat had two brain cells to rub together, they might grab that opportunity and make that a political entry point. But I wonder whether that would even happen. That's what I find so dispiriting, is you don't really get a debate over. Those openings haven't been seized, and I don't think they will be, so probably the confidence being expressed here is well-founded.
No, don't worry. The Democrats they'll fight effectively. I'm not worried about them. It's hard to govern. I mean, this is the main fact. You got to know. It's if you look at the history of American politics over the last 3-4 decades, having the presidency and Congress is not a good thing. Jimmy Carter was a Democratic president, had a Democratic Congress, and we know what happened in 1980. Bill Clinton was president, had a Democratic Congress in 93, 94. Bush is the only one who had a narrowly Republican Congress in 03, 04 and got himself reelected and actually increased Republican majorities in Congress. Pretty unusual times, though, in 03, 04, post 9/11. And now the rubber's hitting the road. And for those of us who are conservatives and believe in conservative governing, this is really a test. I mean, can they execute the policies that they're pursuing, most of which I certainly agree with in principle? Can they hold the coalition together? It's really a political test, and a governing test for the president and his team and the Republican leadership on the Hill. And, I personally hope they pass it, but, history does suggest that it is not easy to govern this country.
Well, that is a part of the source of Bush's strength, is that he has been able to hold the majority of Republicans together on almost any vote. Now, Social Security didn't work. It obviously didn't come to a vote. But on almost everything else he has. He knows he's going to get very few Democrats, and the idea is to get just a few Democrats and all the Republicans. And it still works. It's worked up to now. The question is whether he can still hold it together on something like spending cuts. I've been surprised at the Bush White House. Their response to a call for spending cuts is what you would expect from a liberal Democratic administration. Their response is usually to defend the spending rather than endorse the cuts.
Well, let's see what the audience thinks about some of these issues. We have 4 microphones, 2 on this floor and 2 on the second floor. I'm going to ask those of you who would like to ask a question, if you would introduce yourselves. Also, if you would like to direct your question at a particular panelist, please indicate who you would like to direct the question to. And I know that asking just one question, given some of the thought-provoking comments that we've heard tonight, is difficult, but I would ask that you all respect the many people who want to ask a question and end your question with a question mark and try and limit yourself as you're asking your question. So I'm going to ask the young man in the red shirt to go first.
My name is Michael Lubens. I'm a student at Thayer Academy in Braintree, Massachusetts. I'd first like to say it was a real honor listening to you all speak tonight, and I'm a big fan of the magazine. My question is, given Iran's belligerent stance on the subject of nuclear weapons, what should the United States' response be?
Go ahead, Bill.
I was about to thank you for your kind words and tell you the check was in the mail, and then you actually asked a tough question. I don't know. I'm worried about Iran and North Korea, where these are extremely difficult issues, and no one has an easy solution to them. I think the administration decided a couple of years ago to let diplomacy have a shot. They were being criticized so much for, obviously, Iraq and for being unilateral. So they've had multilateral approaches on Iran with the EU and North Korea, with China and Japan and Russia and South Korea. And I wouldn't say either has succeeded so far. And we now have to really be serious about, we'll see if the Europeans are serious about possibly sanctioning Iran or really being tough and trying to deter them from getting nuclear weapons. It's a tough issue. My own personal view is that you can't stop them from going nuclear with the regimes they have now, and that peaceful regime change would be by far the best outcome. I think everyone would agree with that. The people of Iran deserve to be free, and the people of North Korea, God knows, deserve something better than the horrible, terrible government they have now. Whether we could do more to help the opposition and Democrats in Iran, whether we could do more to help, for example, pressure the Chinese to allow people to leave North Korea and to treat the refugees decently, which I think would have a chance of perhaps changing the dynamics there. I'm not sure about, but I worry that the administration has backed off a little on those fronts, especially in Iran, I think, where the people are sick of the government, I think, mostly, and would like a more liberal order, which would be better for us and better for the Middle East, better for them. So I would wish we would do a little more there.
Anybody else on the
President
panel?
Bush, in a private meeting, once responded to a question about what's your policy in Iran, and he said it's to kick the can down the road and hope there's a democratic revolution at some point. And I think that sums it up pretty well.
One thing that has been done is a broadcast effort in Iran called Radio Farda, which is a Farsi language radio broadcast, which, like its cousin Radio Sawa, seems to focus mostly on pop music and occasional segments of public affairs and news. The reports on it are that it's not terribly well listened to. That's one thing that's been done. That's gathering some of the resources that might be devoted to democratic change into one place, which may or not be a good thing.
One little upsetting aspect with this is it's entirely possible you could get a democratic and classically liberal government into Iran that still wanted the atomic bomb.
But it would be much better to have a liberal.
Yeah.
We don't worry too much about liberal governments that have nuclear weapons most of the time.
France.
Yeah, well, good point. I could even if Iran ends up like France, that would be a net advantage. Yeah.
Yes.
This question is directed towards PJ O'Rourke. My name is Min. I'm a researcher here at the Kennedy School. You expressed considerable skepticism about the competence of government, and you mentioned how self-serving government is. Do you think there's a contradiction, or at the very least a tension, between the conservative principle that government should be limited on the one hand, and on the other hand, the $200 billion program that Bush is passing to help the victims of Hurricane Katrina? I mean, President Reagan once said that the 10 most feared or dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you." Whereas liberals think that the 10 most dangerous words in the English language are, "There's no food, clean water, sanitation, security, or medicine."
I am concerned about the size of this program, and I'm not so concerned about the money itself. I mean, I think Americans are charitable people, and I think that we're glad to help people who have had everything just screw up on them massively like this. But what I'm worried is that this kind of a reconstruction aid and financial aid obscures the kind of thing that government really should be doing down here. There are obviously some very serious problems about allocation of resources and of private property and responsibility. Now, do we think the levees obviously weren't in great shape? And what kind of shape would those levees have been in if they had been owned by the people whose property they protected, or owned by the insurance companies who insured the property that, there's a huge problem with the government flood insurance providing, first place, it's not a very well administered program. Second place, it provides moral hazards that allow people to continue to build places that are essentially uninsurable. There's a lot of fundamental structure here that needs redoing, and the mere giving of money, whether this is too much money, too little money, I wouldn't know to say. But the mere giving of money is likely to distract from the structural changes that should happen. And I fear what structural changes will happen will be yet another layer of government bureaucracy on the agencies. Now we see, which is what FEMA was in the first place. That's a Carter administration program to add a layer of bureaucracy to government emergency response. Bush administration then folded FEMA into Homeland Security, added another layer of bureaucracy on top of, obviously didn't work real well. Should these things, do they need to be more centralized? Should they be perhaps decentralized? I don't know.
One aspect of it is that it seems an opportunity to try again or to talk about trying again certain conservative solutions to the problems of chronic poverty and the problems associated with chronic poverty.
School vouchers, for
And
instance.
we'll see, you know, to the extent that this has been seized upon by conservatives, I think it's because in a strange way they see it as a laboratory in which they can finally conduct the experiment to see if these other types of programs, not just reinstating other programs that they've criticized in the past, whether that will come to anything other than talk remains to be seen.
No, we've seen, I think there's a great anti-poverty program going. All these poor people from New Orleans have moved to Houston where there are actual jobs. Very good. And if you see the polls of them, they don't want to go back to New Orleans. They want to stay in New Orleans, in Houston, where they probably will get jobs.
I'm not sure they'd all agree with that comment.
Yes.
Beyond your own.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Beyond your own, which is the best political magazine here in America or anywhere else in the world, and why?
Can we ask you to introduce yourself, too?
My name's James.
Your question was, which is the best magazine? And why?
Best place for a magazine.
The best place for a magazine?
Political magazine.
Just the best political magazine that you
In the
admire
world.
in the world or here, you know, and why?
I'm having trouble with your accent, so I'm sorry.
What's the best political magazine in the world and why? Apart from the Weekly Standard, of course.
So that was a softball.
No, there are a lot of good political magazines and a lot of different ones, and I shouldn't invidiously compare them. I'm just thinking of the phone calls I'll get from all my friends who edit different magazines if I mention three and not four. I'm serious about this. I'll say this though. I'm very proud of what we've done at the Standard, and people can read the book and read the magazine and make their own judgment. But I actually have paid more attention to reading other magazines since we started this one for obvious reasons. You got to keep up with the competition, and both the friendly competition, people who are somewhat close to us politically, ideologically, National Review, Commentary magazine, and the New Republic, Nation, British, many British magazines, and to the degree one can read other languages, others. And I'm actually struck. I think it's a good time for opinion journalism in the U.S. And I think for one reason is this. I am struck by the amount of PJ really was a pioneer in this, the actual reporting that goes on. And we have found this in the Standard. It's one thing to sit around and have an opinion about everything. It's another thing to go out and really look at what's going on the ground, abroad, or here, or really figure out how some of these programs are working or aren't working. And I think there's been a kind of melding in some of these magazines of real reporting with opinion and informed by a certain point of view that's been healthy. I think a lot of our best pieces, whether it's by Fred or Matt Labash or Andrew Ferguson and Chris Caldwell from Europe, for example, terrific stuff that mixes real reporting with some historical understanding and a point of view.
Yeah, what I would say is read the Weekly Standard and then go to the internet. There are a lot of great political sites, left, right, middle, more than I can keep up with. I look at a lot of them, and I get all the other political magazines, and they wind up staying in my briefcase.
I'd say The Nation. I'd say The Nation for a very simple reason. I would like to see a lessening of influence of politics in life in general. And I think that if you read every issue of The Nation for a year, you'll never want to go near politics again.
So, PJ, would you also advocate eliminating all of the talking heads on television and talk radio?
Oh, no, I would advocate watching them.
Be
watching
careful
them.
here.
No, I'd watch them all.
I was hoping to get a rise out of Fred. Yes.
Hi, my name is Vinny Chapini. I'm a freshman here at the college. I wanted to ask you what you thought the role of Iraq and spending would be in the 2006 elections, and if you thought Republicans would dissent from the Bush administration in their campaigning.
On Iraq?
On Iraq and spending.
I mean, look, 2006 is a congressional election, which means...
Yeah, that's what I meant, the
Yeah,
congressional.
no, I'm saying, so I was going to say, so I think I think Iraq is Bush's, to lead and to win or lose. I think he can sustain enough support for it, certainly, barring something really going drastically better or worse for the next 2.5 years, till the end of his administration. So I actually would be surprised if Iraq is a huge issue in 2006. The Democrats, whatever their thoughts might have been before going in, the huge majority of them, certainly the leadership, the most prominent Democrats, say we can't just pull out So I think there'll be some criticism around the edges, obviously, and some. But I can't really see how in most Senate or congressional races in 2006, I could be wrong, but I don't really see how Iraq plays a central role. So I think the domestic issues are big in 2006, obviously to the usual ones, taxes, health care, general sense of government. You know, gas prices. I mean, we haven't mentioned. I'd say if I were actually, you know, working for a congressman and trying to think about, for a Republican especially, who's been in the majority, and he said they've had a pretty good economy the last couple of years, pretty good rebound from the recession. The thing that might make me the most nervous right now is, are we really going to go into the election 12, 13 months from now with gas at $3 a gallon, going through a winter here where natural gas is up, 30% year over year, and people's heating bills are going to really surprise them. I mean, it's going to be a rough patch for the Republican majority in Congress, but I think more on the economy than on Iraq. And I think, and we might differ a little on this, written about this a lot in the last 6 months, the administration's Social Security gambit, making that the #1 domestic priority coming out of the blocks in January of 2005 after the re-election with increased majorities in Congress. I think the motives were good. The president honestly thinks we've got to address it sometime. Let's get out ahead and address it now. But it meant 6 months that now is going to produce nothing of talking about that issue instead of talking about tax cuts, instead of framing other domestic agenda issues. And that they can recover, but it's a lot of time to lose. To come out of an election, a re-election, with an increased majority, an increased you didn't have a majority the first time, but a real majority of the vote and increased numbers in the Senate and the House, and to put Social Security front and center and then to get nothing out of it is just a political miscalculation. There's no other way to say it, I think.
Yes.
Hello, I'm Raul Prabhakar. I'm a freshman at Harvard College, and this question is for Mr. Barnes. Wouldn't you agree that it's incorrect to compare President Bush's accomplishments with relatively lower approval ratings and a like-minded Congress to Mr. Clinton's accomplishments with ratings usually in the 50s and a Congress that was vehemently opposed to him for 6 years? After all, in the 2 years that he did have a like-minded Congress, he got his assault weapons ban, his Brady bill, his Family Medical Leave Act, and his big economic plan passed.
Well, I don't know, those weren't much. His big thing was his health care plan, of course, which he didn't get passed. Look, Republican presidents with Democratic Congresses, like Ronald Reagan in particular, have done very well. Bill Clinton and Reagan with lower ratings than Clinton. As you can tell, I'm still amazed at how high Bill Clinton's poll ratings were. He's a genial guy for sure, but in the 60s. And I think it's fair. Look, what did he accomplish with Republicans in there? Just Republican ideas, you know. They got a balanced budget, a budget that he agreed with Congress. It was going to lead, and did, to a balanced budget. He cut the capital gains tax. That wasn't his idea. And that's about it. Welfare reform, which he was tempted to veto and didn't, at least Dick Morris says, now I know that's Dick Morris, says that he convinced him to do it, or he would have been defeated by Bob Dole in 1996. Of course, we know now he wasn't going to be defeated by Bob Dole in 1996 anyway. But I think it's a fair comparison. When I've made that comparison, I have noted, of course, you've probably seen it in the Weekly Standard or wherever else I've written it, that I note that for 6 years, Bill Clinton did have a Republican Congress. I think the Republican Congress wound up helping him a lot because they blocked him from following his worst instincts.
I'm not allowed to follow up, am I?
No follow-up.
Follow up afterwards.
Yeah, you can follow up afterwards.
Hi, I'm
Yes.
Jackie Newmeyer. I'm a lecturer in the college in government. How important is it as a tactical political matter or as a national security question that there's a growing division in the Republican Party between business interests who tend to take a rosy view of developments in China on the one hand and China hawks on the other, who may be joined by human rights defenders on the left?
Well, we were China hawks from the very beginning, and we're really in a minority. Obviously, we criticized the Clinton administration and the Republican Congress for being too credulous, I would say, about Chinese intentions in the late 90s. And I actually think the business community has moved somewhat on China. I mean, on the one hand, look, it's a great country, and it's going to be a major power, and no one denies that. And the question is how to manage and deal with their rise. I think the business community, which had real sugar plums in their head about China, some still do, but an awful lot have had disillusioning experiences, is my sense. And I think I think that there's a newer consensus in Washington that's a little more hard-headed about China. And my view on China is very similar to what I said earlier on North Korea and Iran, which is, I have zero problem. It would be great for the world if China became a flourishing, wealthy nation. It would be much better for the world if they became a flourishing, wealthy nation with a more or less liberal regime. I mean, the danger of China is it's an authoritarian regime, and authoritarian regimes, if there's ever a crisis, which there could well be, some kind of recession, they're very tempted to lash out. They're very tempted to embrace a kind of nationalism that could be very dangerous. So I remain very worried about China with this regime. And I think businessmen have been saying for 5-6 years, commercial openness leads inevitably to political liberalization. And it's now clear that that's much more ambiguous. There hasn't been much political liberalization. Now maybe there will be, and I'm not for cutting off trade or anything with China, but I think actually the movement has been, I'm not so sure there'll be quite as big a split, in other words, on China policy. I think there's a little more skepticism, a little more sense that we have to have, it's very important to spend a lot of time working on our alliances with fellow democracies in East Asia, with Japan, with Indonesia, now that it's democratic, with Australia, that we need to support Taiwan. I actually think that's more promising. It would be inconceivable for a president of either party today to do what Clinton did in 1998. And to be fair, this was done with bipartisan support, which was to take, what did he do, a 6-day trip to China?
Never went to Taiwan or South
Never
Korea.
went, well, so no president goes to Taiwan, but he never went to Japan or Australia or South Korea on the same trip. It was just China was number one. Bush has been very different, and the Democrats wouldn't do that today either. So I think the consensus on China has moved somewhat.
I just wanted to add a point. I think we're going a lot on the assumption that free markets will lead to a more liberalized political system. But I think there's a great weight of thought and opinion in the world these days that freedom is not such a good thing. And this relates back to what I was saying before. I think the United States is so used to thinking that its freedom is automatically attractive and automatically looks wonderful to the rest of the world, that we're ignoring the ways in which our freedom is not looking very good to the rest of the world. And it's providing regimes that would deny personal freedoms to their citizens fuel and fodder for saying that in the United States people are out of control. The United States, and I know this is going to offend those who believe in our freedom and liberty, of course, as I do too, but there are different ways to broadcast freedom, and I think at the moment we're broadcasting a kind of negative freedom from restraint, a kind of negative idea of freedom as people allowed to get out of control. And I think that's a kind of a new thing, and I think it's something we should keep an eye on. I'm not sure how to deal with it.
It's not only giving them an excuse, it's giving them a good excuse. I never watched much television until I had kids, and then all of a sudden you're there as a kind of monitoring. Oh my God,
that's when it
this
kicks
is
in.
horrible.
That's
it's
when it kicks in.
Horrible, and it's because it's not. I mean, they're little kids. They're not watching the truly gross stuff. They're watching the Disney Channel, and that alone is bad enough. I'm not so worried about sex and violence. I figure the kids will have to deal with a lot of sex and violence in life. I'm worried about smartass. Can't there be some sort of like smartass censorship of it?
Yeah, that's really easy to censor.
No kid says anything on television.
I don't think you have an interest in promoting this, really.
No, I probably don't. It's true.
That's quite enough out of you.
Well, these Asian countries really worried about that stuff. I mean, what they're worried about, we see now, they're worried about China. I mean, why are all these countries now? I mean, we have better relations with India than we've had ever since the British left. At any time, we see two governments that have just been re-elected, Koizumi in Japan and Howard in Australia. Their opponents were anti-Iraq. Bring every interest that we have in Iraq home. We know Thailand and Indonesia are also interested in having the U.S. stay involved heavily in the Pacific because they worry about China. The U.S. there may be a lot of hatred of the U.S. in Europe, but there's a heck of a lot less in Asia because they're interested in the protection which American power provides.
Well, they're worried about Muslim, and some of those countries are worried about Muslim terrorists too. India, Indonesia, and by extension Australia. As a matter of fact, again, we're thought to provide a counterbalance to that.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Josh Potashnik. I'm a junior at the college, and I actually shot Professor Crystal's foreign policy class today. So I do have a question for you, Professor Crystal.
You're not going to get an A.
Yeah, I know. You've graced us with your presence here at the forum several times before, and at one of your previous appearances, you said that if we were to not find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that the war would have been a mistake, essentially. And other war supporters, Paul Wolfowitz notably, have said similar things. But of course, hindsight is 20/20, and no one really expected that that's what we would find. But at a time when polls show that public support for the war is dropping, do you think it would help build support for staying in Iraq if supporters of the war were more forthcoming in addressing that they had been wrong in the past and owning up to that mistake?
I think we've been pretty forthcoming. I mean, forthcoming in the sense that we, along with everyone else, assumed he had the weapons. We certainly know he did have such weapons and used such weapons, and everyone thought he had such weapons. And our basis for thinking that and writing that in the magazine was UN reports and Richard Butler's reports. We had no access to secret CIA documents or national intelligence estimates.
Well,
so,
maybe we do, but we're not talking about it.
Good point. So, we haven't found the weapons, and I'm perfectly happy to say that that was a terrible failure of, it was partly a failure of American intelligence, it was partly a worldwide failure of intelligence, it was partly due to Saddam, who wanted us to believe, incidentally, that he had these weapons, and certainly never accounted for everything he was supposed to account for after, he declared the weapons originally after the first Gulf War. So, but I don't know that it would help much, no. I mean, I know that this is a popular argument now, that somehow if people really, the president gets up and just says over and over that his intelligence was even worse than you think, and we were all more misled than you think, that somehow people would decide, oh, okay, well, now I can support the war. I don't really think. People know that the intelligence was wrong. We are where we are. We went to war in good faith, I believe, and we've got to win the war, I think.
I never got the weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's like Saddam had done plenty of stuff to justify a war. I could care less whether he had weapons of mass destruction. And then when it turns out he didn't, like, all I can think about is like, well, how crazy does that make Saddam? We thought he was nuts before. He didn't even have any weapons. He could have let, Hans Blix go anywhere he want. Look, Hans, look where you want. Look under the bed. Look behind the toilet. Keep your mitts off my copies of Maxim. And he could have been dictator in a way till, Donald Rumsfeld gets elected president of the World Council of Churches, but no, he said, oh, I've got them, you got to find them. So it never bothered me a bit that there were no weapons of mass destruction. In fact, I'm glad there weren't, because a lot fewer American soldiers were killed as a result.
I'm going to ask that we have two more questions before we close this evening. We have another forum that's going to follow this one with the Foreign Minister of South Korea, so I'll go to you and then you at the mic.
Thank you, Governor Shaheen. My name is Mike. I'm at the School of Education. I don't know if any of the four of you have written on this topic, but I was wondering what you think of the opinion set forth by some conservatives that conservatives should support same-sex marriage because marriage is a conservative institution, and by encouraging people who have been outside of that institution to participate in it, we're actually making our country more culturally conservative.
We wanted an easy question, so we could get through it quickly.
You want to take the second first and then just do both, or you want to? No? Okay.
No,
I don't
go ahead.
support. No, I don't. I mean, I don't think you should support same-sex marriage for some complicated reason like that. You should support it if you think it's the right thing, if you think if it's just, you think that two people in love should be able to marry no matter what their gender, and if you think that marriage fundamentally is between a man and a woman, then you should oppose same-sex marriage. And I think I can't speak for everyone at the Weekly Standard. We have differences on a ton of issues, but I suppose editorially we certainly have opposed same-sex marriage, and particularly have opposed the imposition of it by the courts. I mean, we have not editorialized on the California legislature. If I were there, I would vote against it, but that's one thing. But I think for a lot of conservatives, the issue of marriage, as with so many other issues, is partly an issue on the merits. But we're grown-ups, and we're open to countries changing their mind about lots of issues and it being worked out in the legislative process, particularly in the state legislative process, where there's a chance for people to really weigh in, and different states can resolve it differently. We at the Standard have been very much opposed to the imposition of major cultural changes by the courts. And there, I think, and that's been the crux of our argument.
I think one of the most cogent arguments on the conservative side about it have to do with the redefinition of marriage in legal terms, which is really quite sweeping. And very recently in Canada, there have been several cases redefining marriage in a very sweeping way that I think if a lot of people looked at it more closely, they'd want to at least have it debated more than it's been debated, which is not a brief against long unions or certain rights and benefits for gay people who want to live together. But the legal definition of marriage is a rather unique thing, and it's being rather drastically changed, even as in very recent weeks. And there's a lot of concern about that among conservatives. And if you read some of the more arguments by people like Daniel Sari of Canada or Maggie Gallagher, you'll see there's a lot more there than usually makes it into the press coverage of this issue.
You know, I haven't heard many conservatives make that argument. I know it's an argument I've heard from Andrew Sullivan. He's certainly written about it, but
Bruce Bauer, a few others.
well, not many. I mean, this isn't exactly President Bush and Henry Kissinger making the argument. I agree with Bill. I think it would be very acceptable to conservatives, even if they oppose it, if it's achieved democratically and not through some 4-3 decision by a court.
Final question.
This is for the panel. My name is Brian Haggerty. I'm a senior at Harvard College, and I'm a proud liberal. And my question is whether you feel your magazine contributes to the bitterly partisan atmosphere of Washington.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, and whether that's a good thing for our government.
Yeah. You can't take PJ anywhere, you know?
Yeah.
It's a problem.
I mean, what fun would it be if it didn't, you know? I mean, politics is a blood sport. We don't have bullfighting in the United States, which I think, for one, I think it's a darn shame. But we do have politics, and I'd like to think that we add a little spice to the mix.
Well, we just had our 10th anniversary. We had a big party in Washington, what was it, a week ago? And, well, Joe Lieberman showed up. He's a Democrat. And James Carville, the Raging Cajun, he was there, perhaps just as a spouse, but he was there. And who else was there, Bill? There were other...
Various Democrats. Look, I sort of half agree with PJ in the sense that there's too much hand-wringing about partisanship. Partisanship often is just another way of saying people have strong views, and you know that somehow they shouldn't express them, or they shouldn't organize themselves in parties to fight for those policies, and that's really what politics is. Now, it is a fact that the parties are more different than they used to be. They used to be more liberal Republicans, they used to be more conservative Democrats for various reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's intention, but just have to do with certain developments in the country. The political reorientation of the South finally sort of adjusting to losing its democratic heritage, et cetera. The parties are more, the Republican Party is more solidly the Conservative Party, the Democratic Party is more solidly the Liberal Party. You know, political scientists, I was once a political scientist 50 years ago thought this would be a great thing. Huge numbers of articles, reports by the American Political Science Association, books. It's terrible that voters don't get a clear choice. These parties are totally muddled. There's no accountability. This was a major theme of political science from sort of 1950 to the 70s. Now the parties, just as I said, not by anyone's great planning, but through various developments, have reoriented themselves to provide a clear choice. And now the political science consensus is it's terrible. It's polarizing. What happened to the good old moderate Republicans? What happened to the good old moderate Democrats from the South? And of course, there's some truth in both views. I honestly think the magazine has been strong ideologically at times, and certainly has made, has been polemical at times, but I don't think it's been partisan in a narrow way, in all honesty. I really think you couldn't find much in it that's, praises Republicans because they're Republicans, or bitterly attacks Democrats as Democrats. And in fact, we've praised and been nice about plenty of Democrats, certainly, in terms of on a personal level, and even sometimes agreeing with, 3 months into the magazine, we supported Clinton's intervention in Bosnia and lost about a fifth of our original subscribers who hadn't subscribed to the Weekly Standard to read a magazine that was supporting Bill Clinton, So we've had that, we've done that. And look, we've done actual reporting on, Andy Ferguson wrote a terrific piece on Jack Abramoff and the sort of disgrace of the extent to which the 1994 Republican revolutionaries had become Washington operatives in it for themselves. And Matthew Continetti, one of our youngest and very talented writers, has followed that up with several pieces and is writing a book on that. So no, I don't think we've contributed any more than, we probably haven't contributed as much as PJ would like to the bitter partisanship of Washington.
Well, on that bipartisan note, we're going to end this evening. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you all very much for coming.